I'm going to talk a little bit about more of the practical applications. So I deal less with the science side and more with how to implement it, how to get this technology deployed, and helping companies through the various regulatory and practical applications and human interactions. So we're going to talk a little bit about applications. I'll start out a little bit about why we want wireless in medical. Years ago, back in 2000, I spoke in front of the first Bluetooth SIG is the SIG Special Interest Group meetings in London, and talked in front of a group of 4,500 people who didn't know anything about medical. And at that time, I knew very little bit about wireless, and I have spent the last 12, 13 years exploring the interface between the two. So that's kind of where my world is. We'll talk about some of the problems. I'll present a couple of scenarios, and then I'm going to deal with a little bit of what industry available technologies we might bring to bear on the issue, and then focus on Bluetooth Low Energy, which is one of the newer available technologies that's being deployed in commercial applications. So, why wireless in medical? Well, the previous speaker gave you some great examples from external to internal. The basic realm that I deal in is medical devices. Now, there are medical devices, and there's health and fitness, and there's kind of a gray area in between that people are pushing either side one way or the other. I'm going to focus on this more on the medical device side, and the real test, if you will, to see if it's medical devices, does the FDA care about it? So I deal a lot in the FDA world. But a medical device is a piece of equipment that supports either the diagnosis or treatment of the human condition. Okay, sounds pretty simple. What it gets down to mostly is gathering information. You've got a data source that looks kind of like me. You've got different parameters that come off my body from electrical, chemical, thermal, all sorts of parameters you might want to measure, and they represent something about my condition. You may also have devices that want to affect that condition, things like a defibrillator, a CPAP machine, external devices that are used to change that condition. So those are medical devices. Why do we want wireless technology in medical? It ranges from very, very simple things like wires can be a real pain. They get in the way of treatment. They get in the way of me moving around. People in hospital get better when you get them up and around than they do in a hospital bed. And very complex, there are even emotional issues where if you go into a patient's room, you can tell how sick they are by how many things they got attached to them. And that's very psychological both to the patient and the visitors. So you eliminate those wires, people actually feel better. There's some psychological effects that are secondary and not thought of. So it also gives the caregiver mobility. Previous speaker talked about the disconnected scenarios where you could have remote diagnostics. There are even people looking into remote therapeutics or modifying pacemaker parameters remotely. More and more, we want to take the information, store it in a system that ranges from being able to get a historical record of your condition to simple things like billing. It's called charge capture. One of the most important things about all of this technology is you got to figure out who's going to pay. So it's ultimately important to figure out if a procedure was done or data was collected, how do we pay for it? The last piece is in quality monitoring, and things like a previous speaker talked about EMS. When a treatment happens on site, they always want to go back and do quality review to see, did we treat that appropriately? Could we have saved time? Could we have made things better? There's a lot of post-trauma analysis that goes on to improve the system. I'm going to show a couple of usage scenarios. I put this disclaimer up because I give these kind of talks in front of a bunch of audiences, and occasionally there are people from the FDA there, and so I always have to put the disclaimer. I'm just showing examples. This isn't a real device. You don't do that, and they can come down on you. And since I deal with customers who actually talk to them, I like to be good friends with the FDA. First example, I don't know what happened to the header there. This is an in-hospital patient hub. So these are a couple different architectures I'm going to show that give you kind of an idea. If I move off this platform, does that bug you guys with the cameras? Probably does. Okay. So stay here. Never mind. So the idea here is the patient is always connected. And more, this is the status quo. You need to collect the information. You need to monitor the patient in case something goes wrong. But there are other things that are being tacked onto it, things like patient media. So the same system that is monitoring the patient can be delivering everything from TV to, more importantly, information on the procedure they're going to have tomorrow. So you could sit down, doctors have limited time, you want to know more about the surgery you're going to have tomorrow, what the after effects are, how it goes on. It's a very nice scenario to have you be able to back and forth go over video to find out this information rather than be stressed and have a doctor there for 5 minutes who's got to go on to another patient. So there's kind of an interactive scenario that's happening in the data flow that you will be able to receive data based on your condition. So there's some intelligence going on in the hospital bed. Traditional monitoring parameters would be things like electrocardiogram, ECG, heart rate, pulse oximetry data, respiration, barcode, things like that, that the information needs to go into the system. So I just put a couple different wireless parameters on there. Typically today, most of the electronic health record and the infrastructure is going over wireless LAN, 802.11ab GN. The monitoring parameters as we get wireless are being deployed as Bluetooth, and we'll see more Bluetooth low energy. Always have questions when I present these about Zigbee. I'll show you a slide there and tell you a few of my comments on Zigbee and 802.15. Since I'm in IEEE land, it's 802.15.4. This is going to look, I just kind of redid the architecture a little bit, and this is in day surgery. Today, there are no hospital beds being added in the US. It's pretty much been flat for 5 to 10 years. The growth in treatment is going to these day surgical clinics, and many of you have had procedures done there. You'll go there for a colonoscopy, you'll go there for small surgeries, and you'll be out the same day. It's very cost effective. It's good to get you out of the hospital because that's where all the bad infections happen. You'll get better faster, and it's where the new beds are being added. So if you look around your community, I'm sure you'll see all these little pop-up clinics. They have less connectivity, if you will, but they still have some of the same parameters that need to be monitored. EMS, we've got the same scenario, but now we're really mobile. So we moved from the hospital where it's relatively immobile through the day clinics, which they want to reconfigure, to now we've got delivery of medicine where it happens. And they have the same sort of needs, but the connectivity is going to be more telemedicine, so it'll probably go through a cell phone or a cellular connection, and you need the bridge to the local parameters. One of the things that should be the easiest is how to monitor people in the home. You guys are all antenna specialists. You know all the issues of trying to get a signal to propagate throughout an entire household, not knowing what the construction of the house is, not knowing how many floors are, not knowing how many, if it's an apartment, how many adjacent wireless connections there are. It's actually a very complex problem. And you want to enable mobility. You have the challenges of signal transmission, and all sorts of different devices and different parameters you want to measure because, as was suggested, you might want to monitor whether they're taking their pills. If you've got an Alzheimer's patient, you want to keep them perimeter, so you want to know more about location. It's really a complex scenario. I did work at a company called Instrumetics and did a home health product years ago, and we forgot about a lot of the complexities in the house, which are controllable in a hospital, are uncontrolled in the house. Things like magnetic interference from a leaky clock radio into an electronic medical device. Consumer stuff is not well controlled, as you know. So this is a qualitative chart. Please don't get too analytical on it. Take it to a high level. I use it to talk about the various attributes for our markets, which are medical and industrial primarily, as kind of a comparative tool. So these are the technologies that we like to deal with. They're the ones that are widely available. I saw some other ones put up, the WMTS band, which is Wireless Medical Telemetry System. That's for in-hospital only, and it's a particular band. There's another band that's called MIX that was also in one of the antenna things, which is Medical Implant Communication System, another frequency. I'm not going to deal with those. Those are very specialized and very well understood. The challenges are that we want to get these signals, this information, through the modem we're all carrying around. So we want to bridge the gap between the sensors and what you're wearing and use this now with an app as the communication method. Why? Because it's widely available. I have mine in my pocket. And because the technologies associated with the cellular transmission are changing more rapidly than a lot of the medical devices want. Medical devices typically are deployed in the field and are used for anywhere from 10 to 20 years. And it can take 2 to 3 years to get a medical device approval to ship. By that time, how often does the cellular technology change? So we have to be careful about defining the interfaces, something that can be kept constant. Anyway, so most of these are 2.4 gig ISM band. And I'm not going to go through these in any kind of detail. We don't have the time. I think you guys in the room, some of you are experts in this, probably above me as well. But just to get kind of a feel, classic Bluetooth was designed for cell phones. So it's good at those kind of personal area networks. That's what it was designed for. Wireless LAN was designed to eliminate cables in enterprise situations. That's what it's good for. A lot of these, if you go back to why the technology was developed and what the groups are using it for, where its sweet spot is where it works the best. And when people try and get it outside those sweet spots, we run into all sorts of problems. But if you figure out what it was designed for and can use it in that sense, it really works best. Zigbee 802.11.15.4 was designed for heating, ventilating, air conditioning, to be able to tune all the ductwork and things in a large-scale deployment. It has a mesh network. All the rest of these are star networks. Zigbee works really well for large areas of deployment where the mesh can get a lot of robustness by its geometric properties. Zigbee, I mentioned something I was going to mention in healthcare. The challenge in healthcare with 802.15.4 is it is a direct sequence radio as opposed to a frequency hopper. And it is a direct sequence radio in the same frequency bands as wireless LAN. It's a sitting duck, as wireless LAN gets widely deployed in an enterprise. And by the way, a hospital is an enterprise, some of the busiest networks you'll find. Zigbee has problems with interference because it's a sitting duck. It's a direct sequence. So the frequency hopper radios, that's why I advocate those for sensor technologies in use in those kind of areas. And that actually has borne true. There were some vendors early on who started out with Zigbee against some of our best suggestions and have had problems and have had to convert to other radios. Bluetooth Low Energy is the newest kid on the block here. It's really become widely deployed, starting with the iPhone 4S. We just saw a week and a half ago, Google announced that the next Android version will support low energy. Microsoft already supports it in Windows 8. RIM supports it in the newest Blackberries, so it's already a commercial success. I had one person ask me at breakfast what I thought. The other reason that I'm not as high on Zigbee is that it isn't in here. So it's for consumer applications, it's kind of game over. And it's because of the way the radio was designed to go in the same chip as the Bluetooth Classic. So kind of ideas, they're on the range. They're all, anywhere from 10 to 150, 200 meters. So that's why some of these are challenged in that home scenario, because you can get homes where corner to corner you're exceeding that, or intervening walls, may have metal studs. You guys, again, are antenna experts and propagation. You can tell me more about why that's an antenna problem. So we have some challenges there with some of the home use, and people also in medical often forget about the three-dimensional problem, that you assume that everything's on a two-dimensional plan, and then you go into an apartment building or a hospital or an industrial setting where you got above and below, so you now have to look at all ranges. So cell planning is difficult for that. Let's see, power consumption is really good on the Zigbee and Bluetooth Low Energy. I could very easily be argued that the power consumption should be equal there. The cost is going to continue to improve on Bluetooth Low Energy, mainly because of the consumer deployment there. So what are the big issues in medical? Battery and power. I have for years gone into medical companies who are really interested in wireless, and gosh, we got this great system, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. I said, okay, remember, first thing, when you cut the wire, you gain a battery. Have you guys thought about how your users are going to do battery management? In the introduction, you heard I go way back to the early calculator days at HP. The number 1, 2, 3, and 4 customer issues were always batteries. So the care and treatment of batteries is critical in wireless applications. And it's not just the technology with batteries, it's more how the users are going to deal with it. How are they going to charge it? How are they going to know when it's got charging issues or a battery low? How are you going to go through, in medical, you have to do what's called a hazard analysis. You'd also recognize it under FMEA, failure modes effects analysis. You have to go through a big exercise to figure out what can go wrong and what you're going to do and how serious it is. So when you go to the battery failure modes and effects analysis or the hazard analysis, you end up with a lot of things you need to think about in a medical device. What I'm saying in medical, by the way, you can substitute in aerospace. So if I got friends here from Boeing, they can probably nod yes or no because they've got the same hazard analysis. One of the few sets of industries where quality and regulatory people can actually go back and forth are medical and aerospace. Gain a battery, lose a wire, gain a battery. For medical companies, RF is something really new. One proviso, and that is that the early wireless medical telemetry stuff that's been in hospitals for 40 years that is an area where there is expertise in medical and wireless. The other medical devices have their RF experience is pretty much limited to how do we keep it in the box. And so I'll go into there and say, okay, guys, great. Now we got to get it out of the box. And so they're going, but. So antennas are, for them, a bad thing. And for us in RF and wireless, they're a good thing. Interference and coexistence. I said the home is a rugged RF space, just as an example. Interoperability. This is one that outside of medical, I a lot of times talk to wireless people and they go, we don't get it. Why doesn't medical just standardize on something? And there has been some work and there are some standards, but they really rarely extend up to the data intercompatibility, which is what the users want. And I don't know if I've got any medical device company people here, but we don't like to trade data, which is exactly what our customers don't want. And the reason is that they like to protect their silos. So GE doesn't like to interface to Philips, for example. It's a fact, it's one of those economic facts. International availability, medical devices have to ship worldwide. That's always an interesting issue. And I mentioned touched a little bit on safety and regulatory. Medical devices are in the US regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And it's the Division of Radiological Health that is responsible for administering medical devices. There is a good guidance document by Don Witter on RF and medical devices. It is a draft guidance document. Don tells me he's going to finish it up this year. He had the unfortunate opportunity to witness medical from the wrong side, so he was out of action for a couple of years. In Europe, it's administered under the CE mark. There's what's called the Medical Device Directive, and that's a subset. And other countries have medical approvals as well. In addition to all of that, the medical companies still have to do FCC, Industry Canada, RTTE. So medical is a pretty complicated stuff space as far as regulatory. They don't like to change very often. But it's interesting. At the same time they don't like to change very often, it is a very exciting place for research. So kind of an interesting. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about why Bluetooth Low Energy is an interesting technology for this space. Now, I think I've got a little bit of a primer on LE for you folks who aren't aware of it, but it was designed for low power consumption. It's designed to operate off of coin cells, which is a real kind of paradigm shift, but it's one that was common. It shares with the 802.15.4 Zigbee. Designed to be very simple. The complexity of Bluetooth Classic requires an operating system and something on the order of an ARM microprocessor. The complexity of Bluetooth Low Energy requires an 8-bit micro and some RAM and ROM. It's a state machine. It's very simple. Designed to be simple. It was designed not to require a lot of CPU cycles, to be able to get on, transmit, get off. I like to tell medical and industrial customers that you really can't invent new physics. I see you guys are really associated with trying to get the most out of the physics we have. So there's a limit to how much power we can save on transmitting data. There's Shannon's theorem, there's Maxwell equations, those kind of define the space. The easiest way to save power in wireless is not to transmit. So what you want to do is be very efficient about getting on, getting the job done, and getting off. And that's really where you have to start to simplify. You have to look at the wireless protocols and the technology from a different standpoint to really save power. And that was the whole crux behind Bluetooth Low Energy, which started out as something else, like most of them do, back at Nokia. The real key for Bluetooth Low Energy was that the architects did a really good job of being able to adapt a Bluetooth Classic radio to Bluetooth Low Energy so that they could combine in silicon, so that when chip vendors from Broadcom, Qualcomm, TI make a chip today, it is always dual mode. They don't do single mode. That was a real marketing coup as well for Bluetooth. It's compatible. The SIG requires, SIG is a special interest group who approves the standards, requires compatibility testing only to a generic transport layer, that's GATT, G-A-T-T, generic attribute, A-T-T, generic attribute layer. It's robust and secure. It's a frequency hopping radio. It uses the 2.4 gig to 2.485, divided up into 40 channels. Bluetooth Classic used 79. Hops still at 1,600 times a second, so really fast hopper. Very short transmissions. Excuse me. So that gives a lot of robustness. It has what was put in the later versions of Bluetooth Classic called adaptive frequency hopping, where it will sniff and blacklist channels. So it'll hop on a reduced channel list if it finds a big lobe of 802.11 in there, big channel. Robust and secure. Security was built into 128-bit AES because now that can be done in hardware. And so I kind of lied when I said it was really simple. You only need a state machine. Well, you need a state machine and an encryption engine, but that's all a cell block right now that you can buy. Range, 50 to 250 meters typical. The challenge with range that I run into with customers, again, it's interesting talking to a room of RF people, you understand this. The customers don't usually understand that it's the weakest link in the chain theory. So when I say our products can operate to 150 meters, they assume that they will get 150 meters to the average cell phone. And not always true, right? I mean, you know, this is usually the weakest link. It's amazing, but it's the weakest link. Ease of use, simple pairing is now implemented as standard, and as I mentioned, widespread deployment is just become ubiquitous in the next. Apple gave a figure a year or two ago saying that they expected that Bluetooth Low Energy in their products would exceed the 50% deployment rate June, now. So that's how it gives you some idea. It was introduced in their products with the Apple iPhone 4S, the iPad 3, and all their versions of laptops and desktops that have shipped for the last year. So in approximately, little over a year and a half, there's been a 50% turnover in Apple products in the field. Kind of an interesting figure. It's theirs, not mine. So wide deployment. So why Bluetooth Low Energy? It's good at discrete transfers. It's meant for episodic periodic data, whereas Bluetooth Classic is meant for streaming data. Low data rate, but streaming data. So Bluetooth Classic is used for headsets. Bluetooth Low Energy is not. Because again, as I said, the quickest way to get power down in the RF world is not to transmit. So we like to talk about applications that are, quote, always off. In the sense of radio transmissions, we'd like to have applications that have things like, I'm wearing a Fitbit, which is a pedometer, accelerometer accommodation. It's not transmitting every hour or so. Maybe it'll transmit and wake up. That's a pretty nice low duty cycle. Always off. So how does that match to a medical device? Well, a medical device wants to provide regularly updated data, periodic, episodic, wants to request it. It wants to control other devices. So this is kind of, for a portion of the medical space, this is an unmet need. Bluetooth Classic was too high power. Wireless LAN was way high power, had interference problems, had problems in that it required an access point. There was no ad hoc connectivity. So it's going to fill a space that was unmet. It's already seeing huge uptake in sports and fitness for pedometers, Nike's putting it in shoes, all that kind of stuff. See it in heart rate belts. It's already shipping in from Polar and 3 or 4 other companies in heart rate belts as well. It's very low power. I think I pretty much said this. I want to make sure to respect time and have a little bit. The real key here is that it was designed to operate off of a coin cell. And what this means goes down to the deep levels where the designers looked at it. Bluetooth Classic, because of the peak power consumption when it was transmitting, was unable to operate off of a coin cell. The coin cell just has too high output impedance to source that kind of current. Bluetooth Low Energy actually has pauses in the protocol built in at the low level to allow the voltage level to recover after it's been transmitting too long. So it'll switch up. There are pauses in the protocol that you have no control over, and they're designed to allow the lithium battery to recover its voltage. So it was really thought of pretty well. They did a nice job. I've talked a little bit about adaptive frequency hopping, 40 channels on low energy and secure AES encryption. Very briefly, coexistence. One of the other things that Bluetooth Low Energy did was to be able to connect quickly. When you're frequency hopping is kind of a difficult thing because you have to it's a stochastic process of being able to match up the frequencies and catch it. Bluetooth Low Energy said, well, we need to be able to get connected very quickly. So there are 3 fixed advertising channels in that 40 channel, and they were picked to go around or be at the low spots in 802.11 common channels and be at the outsides toward the guard bands. So being able to advertise on those channels means you can create the link very quickly. Very friendly, that adaptive frequency hopping mechanism. I did some of the early work back when we first were getting some of the 802, or the Bluetooth through the FDA, and that was before they had implemented adaptive frequency hopping. So I did some work in my little lab showing the interference characteristics and what kind of interference you'd expect from 802.11 and Bluetooth in close proximity. And without adaptive frequency hopping, because of the fast frequency hopping rate mechanism, you saw about 15% degradation in throughput and increase in latency, which are the 2 parameters that I always tell people to watch out for. With adaptive frequency hopping, it's down to 0 to 1 or unmeasurable. So that does a really good job. So the other key thing about Bluetooth Low Energy is it's app-based. And I know everything is app-based these days, but this really is designed so that any of the profiles download with the app. And they're talking about the LE kinds of devices as accessories. I even have trouble saying it. Because they're so tightly tied to the app. The profiles, if you have them, or service definitions are downloaded with the phone. In Bluetooth Classic, there are profiles like serial port profile, headset profile, and they have to be built into the operating system to get support. In Bluetooth Low Energy, you implement a GAT, the app brings in like the heart rate profile for a chest strap, or the glucometer profile. So it's a fundamentally different model for the architecture and the hardware and software, so it really is app-centric. It's really tied to the device and what it does in a software way. And it's kind of, it provides the ability to take a lot of the smarts out of the sensor and put it into some more flexible platform for ease of user interface and being able to interface to 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and not have to worry about the evolution on that side. So the basic services, so there's the GAT layer, there are services that allow data transmission, there are profiles that define what the data is, and the data is defined in terms of attributes and characteristics, which I like to think of as bits and bytes. We always have to invent new names for things. But they're definitions of, for example, a characteristic or an attribute may be temperature. The characteristic of that temperature may be measured in degrees Celsius, Kelvin, Fahrenheit. Other profiles that are being worked, there are some standard profiles being worked on at the SIG level, so you can do your own or you can do what the SIG's doing. Profiles being done are in the medical space, non-invasive blood pressure, glucometer, both continuous and spot read glucometers, weight measurement, some of the simple parameters. There's a pulse oximetry, SpO2 for you guys who know that, profile going out. And what that is it just defines the mechanisms by which you transfer that data and what to expect in a standard device. I'm just going to do a very, very quick demo. What I have in my pocket, I do have tricks up my sleeve. This is just an app running on my iPad here. I have, ooh, this is always interesting. So I've got in my pocket here the nearest one, which you can see the best signal on, one of our devices. And our device, I'll show you in a minute, has accelerometer on stuff. Somebody has a Quark. One of the Fitbit ones is me. Somebody else is wearing a Fitbit one in the audience. So we're seeing a couple of devices, Bluetooth Low Energy already. There's the one I brought, actually two I brought, and there are two more somewhere here in the room. So we're already seeing deployment. And there could be more in the room that just aren't advertising, so we wouldn't see them. I'm going to go into our demo. Oops. I was scanning. I didn't connect. We connect to our device. This is just kind of a test application. So I've got a 3-axis accelerometer in here. On here, it's got temperature and what else? Battery level off the coin cell. So this is just operating off a coin cell. Just an example of what can be done. So this is, it looks like continuous data, but it's actually sending data very, very seldom, very short. On, send the data, get off as quickly as possible. It's got a couple LEDs on it, but this is a demo of one of the modules that my company sells. So I got to get in the commercial plug there, sorry. And we'll go back to the presentation here. So I'm just going to summarize, and hopefully we have a little time for questions if there are some, that wireless is pretty essential for medical devices going forward. There is no such thing as an unconnected medical device anymore, or a device that shouldn't be connected. And I've been challenged, when I said that before, someone said, what about a tongue depressor? It turns out you want to know if a tongue depressor's been used or not. And you want to be able to bill for it. So either you do an RFID in it, or you monitor it some way. So you can go down to pretty simple medical devices and you still want to monitor their usage. There is no such thing as unconnected. The latest technologies provide a lot of what we need as the backbone for doing these kinds of operations, whether it be The two-way wireless that I talked about, RFID I've mentioned and was mentioned in previous ones, definitely seeing some uptake. And then I think that Bluetooth Low Energy is a key to kind of an unmet space that's been very difficult to work in. And we're seeing an explosion in applications. You've probably seen a lot on the web as well. We're seeing an explosion in developers too, which has always been interesting. People who were designing games 6 months ago are doing medical applications. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming and being attentive to my talk, and open it up for any questions. Please.
For wireless medical device, I wonder if there are any legal liability issues for malfunction of the device. For example, sudden interference which causes the data to be distorted or cause misdiagnosis.
Sure. No, excellent question. What you brought up was one of the key things that a medical device developer needs to do by requirement. It's also a good idea, but by requirement of the regulations, you have to do, that's exactly one of the lines in a hazard analysis. What happens if you get disconnected? And what the designer is required to do, it's also a good idea, but required to do, is analyze what is the effect, what is the probability, and there's one other factor that I keep forgetting. You multiply those together to come up with the score. If the score is too high, you have to do what's called mitigation. So what would you do at a mitigation in that point? You would say, if it's a life critical, maybe that's not a good application for wireless. That, there's some that you're going to end up that are just great idea, but the risk is too high. There are some that you could say, okay, it'll operate autonomously in a fail-safe mode, and that's okay. And if you go through the risks and say, okay, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, or it could be, the device is just collecting data, and so it will store it until it can reconnect and forward. So you go through these different scenarios and develop mitigations. What do I do? The other part of that question was liability legally. Medical companies and medical device designers struggle with this. We as engineers know devices can fail. Actually, we know devices do fail, all right? We'll admit it. So, you try and do as fault tolerant as you can. You try and run through the failure modes, effects analysis, and hazard analysis. Ultimately, you have to remember the goal here. I used to work in external defibrillators where the fact, and I hope I don't make anybody squeamish here, is that when a defibrillator shows up, the patient is already dead. There's an opportunity to bring them back to life, and that's some of the fun stuff that we get to do as engineers in the medical, is we get to help people in a way that nobody else can. So there is this balance that you have to make. It's safety versus effectiveness. There is no such thing as 100% safe and 100% effective. So we all deal in this realm of probabilities and what's the right thing to do. As far as manufacturers, there are lots of lawyers who write good things. What we're required to do as medical manufacturers is follow the rules, get them approved, do the right testing to present and show that we are safe and effective. And that if you're doing something where maybe you're, I'm going to take a wild idea here. You've got, because wild ideas are what Einstein wants us to do. You are pacing your heart through an external device here, and it's actually affecting my pacemaker. You probably want that an indirect thing. You probably want it to read out parameters and program it so that you use this fail-safe device in here. If you're actually controlling the heart through an RF link, maybe not a great idea. Maybe that's where a wire is a good idea. We do have to remember occasionally that wires, we're all wireless people here. Sometimes wireless is a good idea to keep it on the piece of copper. It's not always obvious that it has to go off the copper. Good question. Sir.
I guess this whole issue of the low power of this is very critical for these devices to ultimately to be implanted and used and time-wise to be utilized. There's a lot of interest now this notion of the power or energy harvesting because the environment has a lot of energy here and there, and we typically let it go. So where is that paradigm in kind of application that you have in mind? I know it's not mature yet. There's a lot of work to be done, but is there an interest in that direction potentially?
There's a huge amount of interest, and I think that one of the other advantages I didn't put on that slide is Bluetooth Low Energy is down in the realm where energy harvesting is reasonable, depending on data rates and all that.
Sure.
But it is in the power levels that are sustainable through energy harvesting. And I've seen people working on everything from the thermal difference, delta T. Right now the most efficient ones are operating at a delta T of about 30 to 40 degrees centigrade, and that's
high.
it's okay if you can expose skin and you're not in Saudi or you're not in the desert in summer. So there's some parameters that are difficult there. I've seen people who are working on crazy ideas like ATP energy harvesting, using the biochemical reactions that are going on in your body and harvesting some of that. There's still a pretty big gap in energy required between those kinds of things. I think thermal, I've seen a lot of work done in vibration. I know some people I've worked with on that. As long as you're moving, that's pretty good. When you get into respiration rates, that's not quite enough movement to energy harvest off of. So it's a space where I think there's a good deal of interest, because as I said, the challenge is you cut a wire and you gain a battery, and if you can somehow lose that battery that way,
Yes.
there's a whole lot of interest in that, and some
Okay.
really cool things being done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.